Thank you all for coming. I'm excited to see so many people here. My name is Jan Grinnell. I am the Archdeacon of the Episcopal Diocese of Rhode Island. I work for this gentleman right here. And I just want to say that I am also one of the chaplains to the university from St. Augustine's, the Episcopal Center at URI, right down on Lower College Road. And these two men have been very important, each in their own way, in my life. I am thrilled that they agreed to be here and share with you some of the things that I've heard them say over the years that I find very inspiring, enriching. And I admire each of them for the journeys that they have been on and the way that they share their life of faith in this world and in our communities. And so this afternoon, I would just like to start with introducing each of them for those of you who might not know parts of their journey. The Right Reverend W. Nicholas Knisely. Bishop Knisely was born and raised in Pennsylvania, and he was raised across the river from where I grew up. I just happened to precede him by a few years. He graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree from Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, then went on to do graduate work at the University of Delaware. While a graduate student in physics and astronomy at Delaware, he decided to study for the priesthood, going to Yale University's Berkeley Divinity School. In 1991, he completed his Master's of Divinity and was ordained to the diaconate in Delaware, and in the following year to the priesthood. In 2013, the state of Rhode Island was very blessed as he received an honorary degree of divinity from Berkeley Divinity School 1 year after he came here. That was the blessing part, not the Yale divinity part. But the doctorate's okay. I mean, that's fine. Nicholas Bishop Knisely served initially as a priest in Delaware, Western and Eastern Pennsylvania before becoming Dean of the Episcopal Cathedral in Phoenix, Arizona. While a priest in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, he also taught physics and astronomy at Lehigh University. In his clerical duties, he was active in ministries that focused on homelessness, communications, college and youth, finance, and ecumenical relations. Bishop Knisely was the first person to chair the General Convention Standing Commission on Communications and Technology. That's our large convention that is held every 3 years that governs our denomination. Additionally, he participated in the Moravian Episcopal Dialogue that drew up the agreement on full communion between the two denominations. Bishop Knisely, catch this, is a vowed member of the Society of Ordained Scientists, a religious order of scientist theologians. So I'm sure you will hear about that along the way. And the man to his left, which many of you already know, is President David Dooley. With more than 30 years of experience in public and private higher education, Dr. David Dooley became the University of Rhode Island's 11th president in July of 2009. Known for his collaborative leadership style that encourages entrepreneurial approaches to problem solving and program development, President Dooley fosters a community of discovery that involves all URI students, faculty, and staff. He has reshaped the university's strategic direction, creating a set of broadly defined goals critical to the university's evolution. In 2010, his transformational goals provided leadership with the overall guidelines for creating a new academic plan and mission focused on achievement and institutional effectiveness. A progress report in 2014 highlights the distinctive accomplishments, and I offer that up to you all to read online. You can go there and read the changes and the progress and the growth that this university has experienced under his direction, which is quite phenomenal. In recognition of his leadership and support of diverse areas of research, President Dooley has been called upon to serve on several regional, national, and international board and committees. These include his appointment as CEO co-chair for the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities Board on Oceans, Atmosphere, and Climate for 2015-16, and his nomination for a second two-year term on the Homeland Security Academic Advisory Council. That's big stuff. That's very impressive. Actively engaging in teaching and research throughout his academic career, in 2012, Dr. Dooley was named a Fellow of the Council of the American Association for the Advancement of Science for his distinguished career of sustained discovery and innovation. Prior to joining the University of Rhode Island, Dr. Dooley was Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs at Montana State, Bozeman, Montana, for 10 years, having served for 7 years earlier as head of the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry. During his tenure there, he was a central figure in attracting research dollars, helping to grow that university's budget to $100 million. Dr. Dooley earned a BA in chemistry from the University of California in San Diego and a PhD in chemistry from California Institute of Technology in Pasadena. So, I offer to you these two very distinguished men of faith and science, and I look forward to them first sharing their journeys of how they arrived at this place, this intersection that some people think cannot exist, and share that with us. So who is going first? Dr. Dooley.
All right. Thank you, Janet, and thank you, Bishop Knisely, for joining us. Welcome to the University of Rhode Island. You've been here before, I know.
I'm the father of alumna. I'm very proud to be back.
It's great to have you back. Jan asked us to think a little bit about what we would share about the journey that got us to this particular point. And for me, that begins in the Central Valley of California, where I was born. My dad at the time was a cotton farmer. Sometime in my early age years, he decided that he wanted to become a minister, and particularly a minister of the Southern Baptist denomination. So he moved us from the farm to Riverside, California, where he attended college, having never gone before and not having really graduated from high school. Then returned to the Central Valley and was a pastor throughout the valley, throughout my years growing up. And it's safe to say that for me, at about the time of being 16 or 17, I realized one very, very important thing, and that was I could not believe what my father believed. And one of the consequences of growing up with a father as a pastor is, of course, you only know theology, you only know the view of Christianity, or of any religion, frankly, through the lens of what your father is teaching and preaching in all the churches that you go to, as well as talking constantly about in the family circle. And I came to this realization after taking and loving, I always did love science. Science in high school and thinking through it. I knew by the time I left for the University of California, San Diego, that not only was I leaving home, I was leaving the Christian faith as I knew it behind. It took me several years to be able to say that to my father. But I think my brother and sister were well aware of my views when I left. And it simply was, the faith as I knew it was not believable in my judgment. And it was primarily not believable because science refuted, I thought, conclusively, and my conviction of that was true throughout my college and education, of course. Science had refuted conclusively many of the fundamental tenets that my father always taught you had to believe if you were going to have faith at all. And since I couldn't believe them, then therefore faith couldn't be believed or held either. And they're the obvious things of the time. And still, to some degree, represented in certain strains of American Christianity today. much less evident elsewhere in the world, I must say. It's a peculiarly, I think, American religious phenomenon in some ways, this perceived incongruity between any religious faith, particularly the Christian faith, and science. But that was clearly what my dad believed, is clearly what he taught, and I decided science was a heck of a lot more believable than the faith that I learned from him as a kid. And I left for a long time. And I've always been attracted to science because I believe and came to believe passionately in the value of data and evidence and logic, and importantly in reproducibility. The essence of scientific discovery is that if you make a claim, it's only deemed valid if other people following your path can reproduce exactly what you found. Just as you said, it should be found. So that's the whole idea of what becomes accepted in science as factual, as an explanation for any phenomenon that we're investigating. And religion is far from reproducible. It's highly idiosyncratic. It's hard to find any two people who will agree on the same propositions of faith. It's hard to find two people who even share the same faith experience, and often have very different contradictory views of what that experience means to them, and incompatible explanations for how they came to faith and what it means to them and to their behavior. It took a long time, I think, for me to get past that, and that was in part just my ignorance, because I did not understand as a kid growing up where I grew up, and I had never taken any classes in religion of any kind. I began to get some sense of that in college in just the Western civilization courses that we were all mandated to take in reading some of the great minds of the world and understanding how they thought about these things. And I had a wonderful course taught as a freshman on really the rise of Christianity. It was taught by a Jewish professor, I'll never forget him, Stanley Charterow, who was a brilliant historian. And he taught about the rise of Christianity through the Middle Ages. And his perspectives were very interesting and illuminating to me, and I thought long and hard about what he had to share in that class, which was, I thought, very thoughtful, analytical, unbiased, and not in any way designed to lead students to do anything other than think thoughtfully through what we were reading and what the impacts of people's lives had been through Rome and the Middle Ages, which was the subject of the class. But that began a reevaluation on my part, and that eventually led to more wide-ranging reading on my part. And like many people of my generation, I'm quite elderly. I'm 66, and that's important because the generation that I represent went through a lot, and one of the things it went through was a lot of questioning about a lot of these issues through a lot of social turmoil in the United States at the time, and questions about what the proper role of any religious faith, but particularly Christianity, was in all of that. I mean, you have to be mindful of the fact that the Christianity that I knew demonized Martin Luther King and many other people who were champions of the civil rights movement, and challenged many of the other things that, frankly, the young people of my generation passionately believed were important for us to confront and to think about. But that walk ultimately culminated, for me, in just a much wider appreciation, much broader and deeper appreciation for the diversity of religious thought, particularly Christian thought and Christian perspectives on things that I've long believed were settled matters of doctrine and faith, turned out to be very much open to different interpretations, a wide variety of positions, and I found that illuminating and I found that energizing, and it ultimately led to, on my part, a re-examination of everything that I thought Christianity entailed. And I finally came to the position that, contrary to my earlier beliefs, Christianity could have a logic to it. It was not fundamentally incompatible with the scientific explanations for the origins of the world and of humanity. It was not fundamentally incompatible with logic and rationality, evidence, experimentation, and reproducibility. And that led, I think, to a profound, realignment in my own mind of what the Christian faith that I'd learned about really could mean to me personally. And through, quite honestly and frankly, not to embarrass her while she's here, but my wife, many years now, Lynn Baker Dooley, had a lot to do with that when we met. She was studying for the ministry, something my father had assured me was impossible for her to do. Because God never called women to be ministers. But she, I think, was extremely influential in expanding my horizons and giving me other perspectives that had never occurred to me before. And so, eventually, I found my way back. And I still hold that faith, despite, frankly, and we could return to this point, spending an awful lot of my time actually doubting that it's real. But on the balance, more often than not, I think it is real and meaningful, important, and plots for all of us, all humanity. Religious faith can give us a guide, if you will, to being our better selves and to being closer to the God that ultimately is responsible for our existence and the universe's existence, and is a preferable way to view the world than one of complete agnosticism or atheism. And that's where I reside today.
I believe it's in Mother Teresa's writing that she admits that there were only a few days in her life as a vowed religious working in Calcutta that she actually believed in God. That most of her life was contingent on she found meaning in what she was doing for people, but she wasn't actually sure she believed in all this, except for a few days, and she says those were ecstatic days, so, you know, it's okay. Word from Mother Teresa, she's a saint and everything. And you all should make sure to ask me about the lost cause narrative and the separation between science and religion, because I think it's interesting that a lot of what you're reacting to comes out of the Southern Baptist tradition. And I think we don't fully, well, just ask me about it and I'll go off on some length on it. So I grew up in central Pennsylvania. My parents were teachers. My mother was an English teacher, and my father was a history teacher. Ultimately became a school superintendent, the high school principal, school superintendent. Flunked out of Franklin and Marshall because he couldn't do physics. And I didn't know that when he convinced me to go there and be a physics major. He ended up at Dickinson and graduated with his degree in history. You know, we used to play a game when I was in seminary about what's your earliest memory. And it's fun to sort of think about that, because often you find a sort of destiny in your earliest memory. The earliest memory that I have, and I know the room I was in, and I imagine it was in my crib, because so it was really precocious early. But I remember lights moving on the wall in the room and being frightened, and then recognizing I heard car sounds, and connecting what I was observing with something that I heard outside, and in a moment making a cause and effect and saying, oh, it's just a car. Those are the headlights. And I think that really is kind of an insight in my own life. I've always been fascinated with trying to see the connections between phenomena that I observe and the underlying meaning to them. I grew up in the early 1960s. The space race was going. My parents had heard President Kennedy call for more scientists. I, weirdly enough, tested out to have an aptitude for science. My parents, being professional educators, thought that I should do my duty to my country, and they pushed me hard to study science. We didn't have much money, but whenever we would be in the store and I, in my 4, 5, 6-year-old self, said I wanted something, if I said I wanted a book, I got a book. If I said I wanted a toy, I didn't get a toy. I quickly determined that I could get books. I got all books. And a lot of my books were about science and the beginning of the rocketry program. I was just fascinated by it. The first book that I remember taking out of a library, 2nd grade, was Edith Hamilton's book on mythology.
Yes.
And I remember reading that first chapter with the description of the various thrones in Olympus, and it was just magical. I just sat and I imagined what the various thrones of the gods were like, and it made me start wondering about meaning that was beyond the scientific, and maybe there was this meaning in narrative as well. I don't know that I could express it in that way at the time, but it was, looking back, what I was actually thinking about. Grew up in a family that went to church, but wasn't terribly religious, which is ironic because of the 4 of us children, 3 of us are ordained clergy, and the one who isn't, we love, but he's a doctor, serves as a physician at James Mason University. Something went wrong, but it's fine. I don't know, I remember in 7th or 8th grade, someone told me about Dante's Divine Comedy. And I wanted to read it because it sounded like it must have been funny. It had comedy in it. So I got a copy of it. I started with the Inferno, and it's not funny. And I was reading my way through it, and I realized I wasn't getting a lot of the references. And there were clearly religious references in it. So it just seemed to me logical when there's something interesting, you looked up the original stuff and you read it. And I had been given a Bible in Sunday school when I was 7 years old. So I got my Bible out and I started reading it on the school bus. And I started in Genesis because I thought that's how you did it. And I started reading forward. And simultaneously, it must have been right around Easter time, because Charlton Heston in the 10 Commandments was on TV. Did you know Cecil B. DeMille was Episcopalian, by the way? True. Did you know that he made Ben-Hur, the robe, and the 10 Commandments to be a way of talking about faith in the broader community? It was his ministry as a filmmaker and as a layperson. He wanted to do this for American society, and he got me. Because I was reading in Exodus about the people of Israel going into the wilderness and God going with them in the account as a pillar of fire by night and a pillar of cloud by day. And in my mind, I'm thinking of the great sort of imagery in the 10 Commandments, and something in my head said, this is really serious. I got to take this seriously. And I said, well, I guess I'll do an experiment. What happens if I'm a Christian? What will be different? So I did the experiment. I've repeated this experiment a couple of times in my life because I've fallen in and out of the church. But in that time, I can date that as being my moment of conversion, when I, having been baptized as an infant, decided I want to take my faith seriously and see what this means. And I didn't know very much. I got off the school bus and said, I guess I'm Christian now. I better not swear anymore. and I started to get involved in our local church. It was a Lutheran church. And began to get to know the pastor. Didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life. And people said, well, you know, you're interested in the church. You're interested in religion. You should be clergy. I said, okay, that seems like a fine choice. We have a lot of clergy in my family. Cousins and uncles are all clergy. it tends to run in families like that in the Episcopal tradition. So I thought that would be fine. Got more involved in the church, and I remember that I discovered that our church was a hotbed of mean people. They were just, I don't know, you should go to church sometime. If you don't go to church, you'll discover quickly that people in church are sometimes really mean to one another. I mean, viciously mean. And I saw that, and I, in my teenage self, said, yikes, this is hypocrites. I'm out of here. And I really just said, I don't want anything to do with the church. I don't want anything to do with these people. God, I'm probably okay with, but this church stuff is just scary. And so I hid. And where I hid was in science. I hid in physics. I went to college. I actually entered college at Franklin Marshall as a dual major in drama and physics. My father and I agreed that's how he would pay the tuition. And I had every intention of dropping the physics after the first year, and he had every intention of me dropping the drama. And I met my wife the very first day of classes, 8 o'clock, calculus class. She sat in front of me. I was smitten, and she's heard me say this before. I was smitten, and I decided I was going to marry her. And she turned out to be in my physics class the next semester, the next session as well. So we got to know each other, and by the time I told my father I was going to drop physics, he said, "You'll have to leave Franklin Marshall." I'm not leaving her, so I guess I'm a physics major. But we were kind of a minor in modern dance, so I was in physics and dance was my background. Graduated with my degrees. It was the Reagan recession. There weren't jobs for people with a bachelor's in physics. You needed graduate work, and my grades were just good enough that the University of Delaware offered me a scholarship and a stipend to be a teaching assistant. And that was great, I took it. And my wife went to study archaeology and historic archaeology at the University of Delaware, so we went off to graduate school together. Did my master's work, and it was in quantum mechanics in closed space-time in De Sitter University. If there's physicists in the room, we were working on trying to figure out if there was a fundamental symmetry that required the bag model. It was a really simplistic understanding of why things didn't pop out of a nucleus, or more specifically, why quarks didn't pop out of protons and neutrons. Turns out, wasn't much there. But I spent 3 years smoking a lot of cigarettes and doing a lot of long differential equations on a piece of paper. Realized I wasn't going to make a career as that kind of physicist. I didn't have the interest or the creativity. And University of Delaware has a really strong program in chemical physics. So I switched to solid state physics and studied liquid crystal phase transitions. And it was just at the time Dejean was doing his work in France, and we were having a race with the lab that I was in University of Delaware, and what Dejean was doing, trying to figure out why it is that phase transitions, even though the systems are radically different, all demonstrate a kind of universal behavior as they approach the critical phenomenon. And Dejean had come up with this idea of fluctuations that correlate over large distances as you get close to the phase transition. And he was absolutely right. And we had a small part in proving that, but he got the Nobel Prize for it. And we didn't get much money. And at some point in that time, my wife got a job in Newcastle, Delaware, and she grew up at the National Cathedral, and there was a church there in Newcastle, Delaware that had a set of bells, and she had learned to ring church bells. You know, you'd think when you ring church bells in a church, you'd make tunes with them, right? But not if you're of English descent, you do mathematical permutations. So, just really interesting. So she would go and do a church, a ring of the bells, and I would go on occasion with her, and eventually we showed up in church. We both liked to sing, we got in the choir. I still didn't believe all this stuff, but I liked being around the people, and I liked it turned out that church was even meaner than the one I came out of. I didn't know at the time. And we got involved in it, and I started to see the behavior. I didn't know what to do, but someone invited me to go to a soup kitchen. And that was what changed my life. Working with people on the street, feeding the hungry, even though the Christians that I was meeting were mean, even though I wasn't sure that I could make kind of a logical sense or find a coherency to what we were doing, I knew that that person was being fed because of what I was hearing read in the Bible. There was an impact in people's lives by the stories that were in the Bible. And people who wouldn't have food had food, and people who wouldn't have had shelter had shelter. And that impressed me. And I started thinking maybe, well, I read the Bible when I was in 10th grade, maybe I should read something about people who wrote the Bible. So I started reading stuff that St. Augustine had read. I started reading some of the greater philosophers. I read Pascal and Knisely. Pascal, you probably know, great French mathematician, philosopher, brilliant theologian. And I was reading through his lives, and there was something more here that I knew. And eventually the church I was going to said, yeah, you seem to be interested in church a lot. Maybe you should be clergy. I asked my wife, and she didn't say no. It's like, crud. So I went off to see the bishop, and the bishop said, it would be great. We'd love to have someone like you. And went off to divinity school. I literally, my advisor had lost his position and had gone to Wayne State. And if you've ever tried to do graduate work without an advisor and you're trying to scrounge lab equipment and everything else, it's not very successful. And I got really close to finishing the experiment and didn't finish it there. Went to Yale. Between the first summer I was at Yale, I went out to Wayne State, finished the research. He published it, and then I was exhausted, went in the hospital for a while. And when I came out, my bishop said, are you going to be a physicist or are you going to be a priest? I said, I'm going to be a priest. And he said, just let it go. So I had a master's, and really, really ADD on my PhD. So I joked about it. I didn't want to get a doctorate until someone gave me one for free. And so when Yale gave me one for free, I said, thank you very much. That's good. I have to admit that what I ended up doing for a long time was I had a scientist part of me that thought like a scientist and did scientific work, and I had a religious part of me that did religious work. And when I was in church settings, I was religious and faithful, and when I was in scientific settings, I was scientific. And there was kind of a difference between them. Ended up eventually going to the church that I served in Bethlehem. They needed someone to teach an afternoon course in astronomy at Lehigh. I was around and I had my afternoons free. I said, sure, I'd do it, it'd be fun. I didn't think about what it meant having had a 10-year hiatus from astronomy that was a rapidly evolving field. And it took me about 3 months just to get back up to speed again. Stuff that we had been talking about as an outside possibility had actually happened, multiple mirror telescopes, some of the understandings about the evolution of the moon. I had to get myself back up to speed. They asked me to teach a physics class because the students liked it, did that, and it ended up sort of being a regular gig for a number of years. The church where I was serving was on one side of the Lehigh River, and Lehigh was on the other side. I was on the north bank, and the college, university, was on the south bank. And it was about a 5-minute drive from one to the other. And in that 5 minutes, for the first 2 or 3 years, I felt a kind of mental and psychic whiplash driving across the bridge, because over here I'm a religious person, over here I'm a scientific person. I had my collar on because I didn't have time to change clothes. And they would look at me and say, what's that thing around your neck? Well, I'm a minister, but let's talk about the Big Bang. And it raised questions in my students' head. I wouldn't talk about religion while I was in the classroom because they were paying me to teach science, and there was enough work to learn science. But I remember one year, just after I finished the final review, I said, okay, we're all set. Are there any other questions? They turned in the reviews of my teaching performance. And this student, a really good student, used to ask me the hardest questions in class. He said, Professor, I have a question for you. Yeah, you're ordained, right? Yes. You believe in God? Yes. you told us the universe is 13.7 billion years old. I said, yes. And that'll be on the final. And you need to know why we think it's that age. It has to do with the correlations in the early anisotropy in the background radiation. And looking at this correlation, and work backwards and get a much better value for the Hubble constant. And they said, yeah. But the Bible says the universe is only 6,000 years old. So you're lying to us. I'm like, oh. Well, the Bible doesn't say it's 6,000 years old. And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, so there's, like, are you talking about Genesis? Are you talking about Bishop Ussher's calculation where he tries to go back through the ages of the patriarchs? Well, I guess. I said, well, so that's wrong. It's a bad calculation, and more to the point, the Bible's not to be read that way. And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, look, in Genesis, right? Genesis chapter 1 has one account of creation, and Genesis chapter 2 has a different account of creation. And they differ in the order of events, they differ in the spatial, or the time frame that it all happens. And people who were putting the book together knew that they had two accounts that contradicted each other. That probably tells you they did not mean it to be read in the way that we now read this kind of narrative. And they just looked at me blankly. Well, I thought, I should talk more about this. Ended up at the end of that being called to be the dean of the cathedral in Phoenix. And the church started to grow. It was really exciting. We were integrating the church, inviting the immigrants and the undocumented into a congregation that had not previously welcomed them. I was busy trying to put out fires constantly. And they asked me to do an adult forum. And I said, I don't have time to prepare anything, but I can teach a physics class. And they laughed, and they said, sure, that'd be great. And I said, all right, fine, go buy this book, Physics for Poets, and it was one of the textbooks I used. And so we started working through it. And it was the most wonderful experience in that moment, because I had somehow, over the years of teaching and running the church, I had begun to make connections between the two fields. And I wasn't having a scientific self and a religious self anymore. There was beginning to be a mutual informing of my views. My science was informing my religious thought, and my religious thought was informing my scientific ideas. And I realized there was something to that. I've since written a couple of books on that. That was the time when I was invited to join the Society of Urbane Scientists. Our vocation is as much as anything else to say, hey, look at me, I'm the counterexample. Right? If you say logically you can't believe in science or religion, and there is an order of priests and bishops and people from the church who do, then either we're all lying or what you believe logically isn't true. So that's kind of our vocation. We're counterexamples. Very exciting. I will say, I just end with this. So part of our rule of life is that we are to talk about science and religion. We're to interpret science to people of faith, and we're to interpret faith to people of science. So we go back and forth that boundary a lot. And I have given a lot of talks around the country. I find that when I'm here in the North, I spend a lot of my time defending religion to people who are essentially scientifically oriented. And when I'm in the South, I spend a lot of time defending science to people. I get a hearing in the South because I'm a religious leader and I'm talking about science. And it just strikes me that there's a real cultural difference. And that goes to, I think, what I pointed out. I think you'll find that traditionally denominations in the United States that had their roots in the Southern experience, particularly around the time of the Confederacy, tend to be much more suspicious of science than denominations which had a more historic foundation in the North. And it has to do with the abolitionist narrative and the slaveholder narrative. I'll talk more about that.
Okay. I gotta say, the most surprising thing about, and that I admire the most about your story, is that you began in Genesis and you actually made it past Leviticus.
Well, I skipped a couple of the begads.
Oh, all right.
If you ever pick up a Bible and read it that way, you'll get to the Gospels and you'll start reading the Gospels and wait, didn't I just read that? wait, I just read that again. And I had no idea that the Gospels were telling the same story 4 different ways. Oh, this is not a novel. It's a library.
Well, let's thank Bishop Knisely. I can't get the red light. Where's Katie? Katie? I don't have the red light.
Here, Jane, if you tell me the question to ask, I can say.
No, I'm not.
Okay.
So what I would like to do is, does anybody in the audience have a question for either of these two? And that's why I'm going to get the microphone, and I'll be right back there in a second. Did the battery run out?
So while she's going back, let me just say something about the thing I was, because I really want to take some time and write this up. But Mark Knoll did some research into the theological implications of America's experience in the Civil War. And essentially what ended up happening is if you are a slave owner and you are profiting from the enslavement industry, you need to find a way to morally support what you're doing. And if you read the Bible in a literal way, you can find plenty of passages in the Bible that support the owning of slaves and govern how slaves are to behave towards their masters and what slaves' expectations are. If you want to read it from an abolitionist perspective, you're going to find that you have to read the Bible as a narrative that leads in bondage and brings God's children into freedom. And you see in American theology 2 sort of theological readings of the Bible beginning to emerge, and it happens about 1840, 1850. And you can see it, the Massachusetts voices are the strongest in the abolitionists and the Southern Baptists, and ultimately it turns out to be the Princeton method of reading the Scripture, what's called, comes out of and supports the South. Darwin publishes his work about 1860. So just at the beginning of the Civil War, and Darwin comes out and he just pokes a giant hole in the Genesis account. And if you're going to read the Genesis account, the first chapter literally, or the second chapter literally, there's no space for evolution there, which means you stand convicted of going against God's will. And so you have to tear that down, and you have to create a cognitive dissonance where you live in a scientific world of progress and technology, except for that part. If you want to think about why climate change is so hard for people to understand, I think sort of baking in that cognitive dissonance into our American culture, it's uniquely American because of the history we have of the great stain and scar on our story. It leads us to this place where we have the ability to believe something passionately and dismiss any evidence that would contradict it. I'll leave it to the reader to think about American politics today, or American scientific conversation, or cultural things. I mean, it's all of a piece, and it crosses across all sorts of groups. So, you have a question?
Okay.
Yes. Hi. Quick question. Are we including faith in today's conversation? That's one. And also, are we including the other religions in today's conversation? Just so that I can follow the rest of the conversation with more clarity.
So could you help me understand what you mean by the word faith?
So then let me take a step back. Do you think there's a difference between religion and faith?
Yes.
And if there is, then are we including faith in today's conversation because of the heading? Or I think, because you did, maybe I misunderstood, you did use faith and religion in your introduction. So I thought maybe interchangeably at times, maybe not, that was maybe my interpretation. But are we going to make that distinction moving forward between faith and religion versus science? Not versus necessarily, but and science? That's the first question. And then the other religions, meaning Judaism perhaps, or Islam, or Buddhism, you name it. Everything else.
President?
He's not the
Well, I'll I'll think a little bit while he answers.
Okay, yeah, I'll give you a layman's answer, because I am not a theologian nor a philosopher. So the distinction I draw is one can have faith in a great many things, and religious faith is a kind of faith. That's how I look at it. It's and not all religious faiths are the same, nor do they demand the same kind of understanding of what it is you're professing. At least that's the impression I have. And for me, actually, one of the issues I always had with religion was, like I said, go back to this area of reproducibility. Science doesn't demand, in many respects, the same kind of faith that religion does. The evidence of things not seen, the hope for, etc. I mean, evidence of things not seen, that's sort of, in some respects, related to the scientific quest to see more and more, because you want evidence of what you can see, and if you can't see it, then there's a lack of evidence. So that's sort of how I think of it myself, and for a long time that was one of the issues I had with any religion, that in the sense that all religions demand a certain amount of faith in something for which there is no evidence, or at least very weak evidence, or very inconclusive evidence, or evidence that can be interpreted in a variety of different ways. And so anyway, that's how I think frequently about the distinction between faith on the one hand and religion on the other, that they're of a kind, and religion is a particular kind of faith that can certainly guide one's entire life. And I know many people where that's been true. And for others, having that faith seems just insurmountably difficult. And others, like myself, went back and forth over that divide.
So, thank you. I've had a chance to think. I appreciate it. So faith is a term, it's a term of art within Christianity. And it means something very specific within Christian thought. And I think we tend to use it carelessly. Religion would be a religious thought. Let's just define it this way, and then you can argue with my definition. But religious thought would be a series of, a set of assents to behaviors and beliefs. Faith, at least within the Christian world, is a trust in something, a hope in something that makes no sense at all. And it's not a matter of believing something is ridiculous, it's believing that things will turn out even when there's no reason to logically imagine they will turn out. We talk in Christianity about this Easter moment. In the midst of darkness and death and evil, something astonishing happens and there is a rebirth. I think I'm nervous of talking about other faiths, other religions' understanding of faith, because I'm not even sure I'm completely comfortable talking about Christianity in a monolithic way. I'm an Episcopalian, and I think I can speak about what some Episcopalians believe. There's an old joke, if you ask an Episcopal clergy person, what do we believe? He'll say, some believe this, some believe that. You can make an argument, and people have made the argument, that Christianity is a philosophy, not a religion. You can make a counter-argument that it's a religion, not a philosophy. You can make that argument within Judaism. I think you can talk to rabbis that Judaism is a philosophy. You can talk to rabbinical idea that it is an assent to a faith in creating God. I am told, I'm not an expert in Buddhism, but I'm told there are strains of Buddhism that are primarily philosophical. And there are strains of Buddhist thought that are much more what we would think of in a set of beliefs, a set of assents to ideas that would string normal credulity, and that would fall under the religious language. Within Islam, There's such a wide divergence between Sunni and Shiite, between Wahhabi faith, between Sufi faith. I'm just never comfortable saying one faith believes the other thing. So I think when we're talking about science religion, let me bring it back down. My experience of science, and I'm trained as a physicist, so I'm a hard scientist. I'm not trained as an anthropologist or a psychiatrist or an economist, and they might make a legitimate claim to be scientists, but I wouldn't. They do their scientific work differently with a different set of proof criteria than we might have in the lab. In hard sciences, the lab always wins. That's what you're referring to. I'd feel much more faithful about scientific truth if I believed that every experiment was verified independently. But what we're finding is lots of experiments are published, and there's a magic drawer of data points in some researcher's desk. I had one of those in my department, well, I won't tell you his name, just always managed to find extra data points. And I think I will talk about my faith and my religious belief, and I can talk it from my direction.
Are there other questions? Yes, sir.
Hi, question for Bishop Knisely. You're probably familiar with John Polkinghorne.
He's a member of the Society of Ordained Scientists.
Yeah, another
One of the founding members.
Anglican physicist, theologian. Could you speak a little bit to understanding Genesis 1 and 2 from the standpoint of, sometimes it's framed only in terms of literal or not literal. You know, and he would bring up, obviously, that this is theological writing, it's poetic writing, it's liturgical writing, other ways to understand the Genesis narrative apart from just pretending that it's trying to be a science book when it obviously isn't.
So let me just start with Genesis 1, which is basically a gloss, I believe, on the Sumerian creation story, which is very similar, but they take the days of creation, they rearrange things. The sun is moved to, what, the third day? The first day of creation, there's light and darkness, and on the third day, you make the sun and the moon, the lights in the sky. So light and darkness and the sun and the moon are different things. If you believe the sun and the moon are gods, to demote them to the third day of creation and make light the first day of creation, that is both a political and a theological assertion. And if you are in captivity in a culture that has a different story of its origin, that becomes a story that creates a narrative that builds a nation. And Von Ram and some of the theologians who study Hebrew scripture would argue that's a lot of what's going on in that thing. There is an important theological point about the quality of what God is doing at the very end of that first narrative, when God at the end says, this is, the Hebrew is pretty demonstrative. This is really good. What I just made is really good. And that's something that we lose track of. So there's a deep theology. There's a lot of that in there, and the ordering and the structure. It's evocative because there is an unfolding in that first chapter's narrative that echoes what we think happened in the magic singularity that became the Big Bang. And it perhaps out of a multi-universe. Someone should ask me a question sometime about the anthropic principle, and the greater anthropic principle particularly. But I think it's evocative, and so people get excited. Just, it's worth remembering that Fred Hoyle, who was the Astronomer Royal in Britain, he coined the term Big Bang Theory because he thought it was a stupid idea. The idea that the universe had a beginning and wasn't timeless and eternal was shocking to the scientists of the 1960s and required immense proof, and it was the proof of the microwave background radiation that forced that to happen. But that was still controversial in the 1960s, but really interesting in the way it seems to connect to the Genesis narrative in kind of an unfolding.
Question here.
Thank you. One thing you mentioned about science and religion, I was thinking of a couple of practical examples where you see how science has been able to explain or perhaps prove something that we just assume by faith. I remember a couple of years ago you did a presentation about the Star of Bethlehem and what exactly it was that the wise men followed. Could you comment on that for a little bit, please?
I didn't make that comment.
So the Star of Bethlehem, the short version is, remember the story of the wise men? And how many wise men were there?
Many.
Why? It doesn't actually say, yeah, 3 gifts, right? It doesn't actually say in the account that there are 3. It just says magi. Magi, which we know are in Persia, they see a star in the east, right? And they follow that star to Israel, but Israel is in the west. So they, I mean, even for men, that's pretty bad. And it turns out, and they said we saw the star is rising, it turns out that that's all full of Greek astronomical language. The star is rising is essentially Helaical rising. Helaical risings are really important in Greek and Persian, particularly astrology. It's the first time the star appears above the horizon after it's passed behind, or the sun's passed in front of it. So it's like the new birth of a star. And long story short, the Romans and other people had talked about a particular astrological event that happened as a Helaical rising about 4 BC at a date. They struck coins about it, and that's the most, Occam's razor, multiplicity ought not be posited without necessity. That's the most logical and simplest answer for why that is. But that's history and through mechanics. I think where I find science helps me in religious thought is, so we have this question about, different religions believe different things. Does that mean you automatically dismiss it? Relativity, special relativity at least, says that different observers will see different things and they're all correct, even though they're seeing different sequences of events. Some people will see 2 things simultaneous, some people will see things as not simultaneous. Who's correct? You can't say in special relativity. In general relativity, you can get a little fussier, but still, there is a relativism to the observer. And Einstein's fundamental idea is you can't gainsay that. Well, that means that observer priority and observer integrity has to be taken seriously. In religious thought, if someone tells me they have had an experience of God, informed and inspired by my religion, by my scientific experience, I could say, I'm not going to tell you your experience of God is wrong. I'm going to work with you to help you unpack what that experience of God might mean to you. So I'm much more comfortable, because I'm a physicist, in not dismissing people's ideas that don't fit in what I think has to be. I call my blog Entangled States, because entanglement is one of those things that's not allowed in an Enlightenment worldview. So Newtonian physics is the sort of supreme expression of an Enlightenment worldview. You have an answer, it's yes or no, right? It falls or it doesn't fall. It hits the ground at a certain moment or it doesn't hit the ground at that certain moment. And that yes or no, that binary thinking is incredibly successful. We build all kinds of cool things like architecture, bridges, things like that with it. But it's a part of what science is. It's not the ultimate expression of scientific thought. Quantum physics moves beyond that idea of binary thinking, and you end up with yes, no, and maybe, kind of a tri-state logic. Entangled states is something that's true, observably true, incredibly importantly true, and it has no place in Enlightenment thought. And that has been a wonderful thing for me, because if I'm trying to think about faith as being a yes-no thing, I can get yes, no, and maybe, and I can say I'm not just rejecting Newton. What I'm doing is embracing a larger understanding of scientific thought. And if I want to be a smart aleck, I can say if I want to believe that God's twiddling the dials in evolution, there's plenty of space in quantum physics for some tweaking. You don't have to have sort of a giant kick coming in from outside the universe for there to be space for some kind of arc of narrative to be being played out in the experience of the evolution of the universe.
I love the title of your blog, by the way.
I was having a good day when
Yeah, I think that captures a lot of how I think. I mean, science is done by humans. Let me start with that. So it is true that the road to scientific truth is full of fits and starts, gross errors, misunderstandings, human pride, failings, and all the rest of it. But it's also the case that there's an inherent logic to science that over time undercomes all of the human failings of those who practice it. And you're right, it is ultimately the point that if you're going to accept something as true in the realm of science, generally speaking, that means there either are no exceptions or you've specified what the possible exceptions are and they don't exceed, they don't get outside those specifications. It means science, particularly chemists and others, are fond of saying there are no exceptions to the laws of thermodynamics ever, anywhere. The U.S. Patent Office is perfectly justified rejecting any patent whatsoever that involves either perpetual motion or any other violations of the laws of thermodynamics as being fundamentally impossible, no matter how cleverly it's presented.
And yet the universe exists.
And that's not a violation of the law of thermodynamics, actually. So that's the pinnacle. That's one of the examples of the pinnacles that science contains. And you spoke of two others. Quantum mechanics completely revolutionized our thinking of the world. The world is not the way it appears to us. Now, it turns out that's because we're big and heavy. The world looks very different at the level of an electron or an atom than what it looks like to us as observers. But there are ways, in fact, Nobel Prizes were awarded, and all those experiments are perfectly reproducible and been reproduced hundreds of times over the course of science. There are ways to prove that all of the incredible claims of quantum physics and quantum mechanics, which were completely counterintuitive to every scientist who lived before they were developed, are actually true. And I think general relativity is much the same way. It's withstood every test, and there have been many rigorous, demanding tests of general relativity, and in every single one, it's proven to be accurate in its description of the universe. We don't quite know how to connect quantum mechanics on the one hand and general relativity on the other. That's one of the great unsolved mysteries of science today, is how can both those things be simultaneously true, and how do you generate an understanding of the nature of the universe from those scales, the microscopic to the largest universe-wide scale, in a coherent, self-consistent way. We're still looking for that.
Could I just add
Sure.
that, I mean, much to the chagrin and disappointment of physics grad students, general relativity keeps being shown to be true, and more interesting, the standard model of particle physics keeps being verified, which is all well and good. The problem is that we are seeing dark matter and the evidence of dark matter. We see the evidence of what they call dark energy, the rapid accelerating expansion of the universe, neither of which there's any place for in the standard model or general relativistic theory, except in general relativistic theory, you put in the cosmic expansion factor, which is Einstein put in and then took out and has now been put back in again. So there's science out there, and there's really interesting things out there, and most of the universe is made up of all these really interesting things that our scientific models don't even get close to. And so there's wonder, and it's joy, and I think the problem sometimes with science is it's so incredibly successful in dealing with the kinds of problems it can answer that we award it a kind of pride of place that maybe isn't healthy.
That's a good point. One of the most influential lectures I ever heard was a graduate student at Caltech. We had an English Nobel Prize winner come, Sir George Porter, who won the Nobel Prize in chemistry for basically inventing a way that had never been thought of before for monitoring what happens in very, very fast chemical processes. And he, in that invention, unlocked a whole universe of new chemistry to be explored and a whole level of understanding of everything that happens in biology and in chemistry at a time scale that was appropriate to those events actually occurring. So he won the Nobel Prize. He was one of 2 or 3 people, I think, that won the Nobel Prize for those kinds of insights. Came to Caltech and he gave a talk that was enthralling, frankly. And it was, in a certain sense, almost the height of what you might call my more atheistic approach to the world. He said, his argument was, there's no place in the world anymore for religion of any kind. Science is preeminent. Science replaces all religion. You need nothing other than the scientific method, the theories, the experimental approaches, the conclusions of science define perfectly all that humans can and ever will know.
The Rutherford moment.
Yeah. And that was his hypothesis, and it was compellingly presented by one of the most articulate public speakers of science you have ever encountered. And it was amazingly impressive to all of us sitting in the audience who were young graduate students at the time, as well as, frankly, the faculty, chemistry and physics faculty, the California Institute of Technology, who made up the primary audience that was there along with their graduate students, which we happily went along for this event. And that fueled my thinking for a very, very long time. And it was only, and I think you alluded to it, Bishop, very well, when I began to understand that, no, there's still room for things that may be outside of science and still be true. I mean, Porter's claim was science is true, anything out of science is questionable. If it can't be scientifically verified, then there's no reason to believe that it's true. And I think as humans, we're always looking for what we think is true. We're having a great debate right now in this country about the meaning of truth and whether there is such a thing as objective truth. But I think that just is one more manifestation of the fact that what we all essentially are looking for is things that we can hold on to. This is true, this is real, and I can rely on that. I can base my life or decisions in life or my path in life or the decisions I need to make about anything on these things that I know confidently to be true. It's that search for truth. And so the assertion that Porter would make is there's no truth outside of science, and I think one of the things that I've come to realize to a degree of satisfaction in myself is that no, there is room for truth outside of that. That it's too narrow a view of the universe we inhabit. The difficulty for me as a scientist is you can't prove that.
So as a physicist, which truth is yours? And I've had this conversation with philosophers. I think it's a shame we should have a philosopher sitting up here. Because I think that question is there truth, is one of the things that has really driven modern philosophy. And I'm told that what they've decided ultimately is what matters is meaning more than truth. What meaning does scientific endeavor give to our lives?